On August 15, 2025, something unprecedented happened in the frozen wilderness of Alaska. For the first time since taking office, President Donald Trump sat down face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin in what many are calling one of the most significant diplomatic meetings of the decade. This wasn't just any ordinary summit. This was a high-stakes negotiation about ending one of the most devastating conflicts of our time, the war in Ukraine. What actually happened behind those closed doors? What did both leaders walk away with? And what does this mean for the future of international relations? Today, we're breaking down everything we know about this historic Alaska summit, analyzing the key takeaways and exploring what comes next in this complex geopolitical chess game. But before we dive deep into this analysis, if you're interested in staying informed about major international developments and want expert breakdowns of complex political events, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This meeting wasn't announced weeks in advance with typical diplomatic fanfare. Instead, it emerged from intensive behind-the-scenes negotiations, with Alaska chosen as neutral ground that holds symbolic significance for both nations. Alaska was once Russian territory before being sold to the United States in 1867, making it a fitting location for this historic encounter. The primary focus was unmistakably the war in Ukraine, a conflict that has raged for years, reshaping international alliances and causing immense human suffering. Both leaders came to the table with enormous pressure from their respective domestic audiences and international partners. For Trump, this represented an opportunity to fulfill campaign promises about ending foreign conflicts. For Putin, it was a chance to potentially secure terms that could be presented as favorable to Russian interests while easing economic pressure from international sanctions. The meeting's format tells us something important about the seriousness of these discussions. Unlike typical diplomatic summits that include large delegations and extensive media access, this was kept relatively small and private. Both leaders brought minimal staff, suggesting the most sensitive discussions happened at the highest levels with limited intermediaries. What makes this summit particularly significant is the timing. The international community has been watching as various peace initiatives and diplomatic efforts have failed to gain meaningful traction. Previous attempts at negotiation have often been undermined by fundamental disagreements about territorial sovereignty, security guarantees, and the basic framework for any potential agreement. The Alaska meeting represented a different approach: direct, high-level engagement between the two most powerful figures in this conflict dynamic. Regardless of one's political perspective, any sustainable resolution to the Ukraine conflict likely requires some form of direct engagement between Washington and Moscow. The choice to meet in Alaska, rather than a traditional international venue like Geneva or Vienna, suggests both leaders wanted to avoid formal protocols and media circus that typically accompany such high-profile summits. Alaska provided a more controlled environment where substantive discussions could take place without constant media glare and pressure of public statements being immediately analyzed. Moving into the specifics of what we learned from the summit, both leaders made public statements immediately following their discussions that provide important insights into the nature of their conversations and potential paths forward. President Trump emerged from the meeting using characteristically optimistic language, stating that great progress had been made during the discussions. This phrasing is significant because it suggests substantive engagement without committing to specific outcomes or timelines. Trump's communication style often emphasizes positive momentum and potential for future success, which appeared to be his approach in describing the Alaska summit results. Putin's response was equally measured but employed different diplomatic language. The Russian president referenced reaching an agreement during the post-meeting news conference, though notably, there was no mention of a specific ceasefire or immediate cessation of hostilities. This distinction is crucial because it suggests that any understanding reached may have been more about process and framework rather than immediate operational changes on the ground. The absence of a ceasefire announcement is particularly significant because many observers expected that any successful meeting would need to produce at least a temporary halt to military operations as a confidence-building measure. The fact that neither leader announced such a development suggests that discussions may have focused more on longer-term arrangements and conditions that would need to be met for sustainable peace. One of the most important aspects to analyze is what wasn't said during the public portions of the summit. Neither leader provided specific details about territorial arrangements, security guarantees, or the framework for potential Ukrainian sovereignty. This silence could indicate either that these issues remain unresolved or that any preliminary understandings are too sensitive to discuss publicly at this stage. The diplomatic implications extend far beyond the immediate participants. European allies, particularly those in NATO, have significant stakes in any resolution to the Ukraine conflict. The fact that this meeting occurred without extensive prior consultation with traditional allies suggests that Trump may be pursuing a more unilateral approach to resolving the conflict, which could create tensions within the Western alliance structure. From a strategic perspective, the timing of this summit is noteworthy. It occurs at a moment when both sides may be experiencing what military analysts call conflict fatigue, the point where costs of continued fighting begin to outweigh potential benefits of military victory. This dynamic often creates openings for diplomatic solutions that might not have been possible earlier in a conflict. The economic dimensions of any potential agreement cannot be overlooked. The war in Ukraine has had massive economic consequences, not just for directly involved parties, but for global supply chains, energy markets, and international trade. Any sustainable resolution would need to address questions about reconstruction funding, sanctions relief, and restoration of economic relationships. If you're finding this analysis helpful and want to stay updated on how this diplomatic situation develops, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We'll be following this story closely and providing updates as new information becomes available. Analyzing the strategic implications of the Alaska summit requires understanding how this meeting fits into broader patterns of international diplomacy and conflict resolution. The choice to pursue direct, high-level engagement represents a significant shift from the multilateral approach that has characterized most previous diplomatic efforts regarding the Ukraine conflict. One of the most significant aspects of this summit is what it reveals about Trump's approach to international relations during his current term. Unlike his previous presidency, where much of his foreign policy was conducted through traditional diplomatic channels with extensive input from the State Department and National Security Council, this Alaska meeting appears to have been organized with a much smaller circle of advisors and with greater presidential control over the process. This personalized approach to diplomacy has both potential advantages and risks. On the positive side, it allows for more flexible and creative problem-solving without constraints of bureaucratic processes and institutional positions that might limit negotiating flexibility. High-level personal relationships between leaders can sometimes break through impasses that have stymied lower-level negotiations. However, this approach also carries significant risks. Complex international agreements typically require extensive technical expertise, legal review, and coordination with multiple government agencies and allied nations. Agreements reached through personal diplomacy may lack institutional support necessary for effective implementation and long-term sustainability. The international legal framework surrounding any potential agreement presents particularly complex challenges. The conflict in Ukraine has involved alleged violations of multiple international treaties and conventions, including the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, and various bilateral agreements. Any settlement would need to address how these legal issues are resolved while maintaining credibility of international law itself. Economic considerations play an increasingly important role, as the conflict has created significant costs for all parties involved. The financial burden of military operations, reconstruction needs, and broader economic disruption caused by the war create incentives for negotiated solutions. However, economic arrangements in any settlement would need to address questions about reparations, sanctions relief, and restoration of trade relationships. The energy sector represents a particularly complex aspect of any potential agreement. Europe's energy security concerns, global oil and gas markets, and the role of energy exports in the Russian economy all factor into broader negotiation dynamics. Any sustainable agreement would need to address how energy relationships might be restructured in a post-conflict environment. Regional security architecture presents another crucial dimension. The war in Ukraine has fundamentally altered European security arrangements and raised questions about effectiveness of existing institutions and treaties. Any resolution would need to address not just the immediate conflict, but also longer-term security guarantees and arrangements that could prevent future conflicts. The role of NATO and other alliance structures adds complexity to any potential agreement. These organizations have invested significant political capital and resources in supporting Ukraine, and their continued relevance and effectiveness depend partly on how the conflict is ultimately resolved. Any agreement that appears to reward aggression or undermine collective security principles could have lasting effects on these institutions. As we look toward the future implications of the Alaska Summit, several key factors will determine whether this diplomatic engagement leads to meaningful progress or becomes another footnote in the long history of this conflict. The immediate aftermath of the summit provides important clues about its potential significance. The measured language used by both leaders suggests that while substantive discussions occurred, any concrete outcomes remain uncertain. This pattern is common in high-stakes diplomacy, where initial meetings often focus on establishing communication channels and exploring possibilities rather than achieving final agreements. One crucial factor will be how both governments follow up on whatever understandings may have been reached in Alaska. Effective diplomacy typically requires sustained engagement through multiple channels, including technical experts, military officials, and regional specialists who can work out complex details that high-level meetings can only outline in general terms. The international community's response will significantly influence the trajectory of any agreements emerging from the Alaska discussions. European allies, in particular, have invested enormous political and economic capital in supporting Ukraine and maintaining sanctions against Russia. Their willingness to support or oppose any potential settlement will largely determine its viability and effectiveness. Military developments on the ground will continue to influence diplomatic possibilities. History shows that negotiated settlements are most likely to succeed when they reflect military realities rather than contradicting them. The current battlefield situation and any changes in military momentum will affect negotiating positions and flexibility of all parties involved. Domestic political considerations in both the United States and Russia will play crucial roles in determining what agreements are politically feasible. Trump faces pressure from various constituencies who have different expectations about American involvement in international conflicts and the appropriate balance between engagement and restraint in foreign policy. Ukraine's position remains central to any sustainable resolution, despite not being directly represented at the Alaska Summit. Ukrainian leadership has consistently emphasized that any agreement must respect sovereignty and territorial integrity principles. How future negotiations incorporate Ukrainian perspectives will be crucial for international legitimacy and long-term stability. The humanitarian aspects of any settlement will require sustained international attention and resources. Reconstruction efforts, refugee resettlement, and addressing social and psychological trauma caused by the conflict will require long-term commitments from the international community that extend far beyond any immediate political agreements. As this situation continues to develop, staying informed about these complex international developments becomes increasingly important. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to our channel for continued coverage of this story and other major international events. Your subscription helps us continue providing in-depth analysis of the stories that shape our world. Looking forward, the Alaska Summit may be remembered as either a crucial turning point that led to sustainable peace or as one of many diplomatic efforts that ultimately failed to resolve this complex conflict. The coming weeks and months will be crucial for determining whether the great progress referenced by President Trump and the agreement mentioned by President Putin translate into concrete steps toward resolving one of the most significant international conflicts of our time.